The first thing to understand about a medieval town is that it was alive, and not just with people. It was crowded with animals, industry, and waste. All these things created a constant, powerful smell. It's the baseline smell that we in the modern world have completely lost. So, yes, by our standards, it smelled bad. The question is, what made it smell that way? Let's start with the streets themselves. Most were not paved. They were dirt, or maybe packed gravel. When it was dry, they were dusty. When it rained, they turned to thick, clingy mud. This mud wasn't just soil, it was a sponge for everything that was thrown or dropped onto it. And a lot was thrown onto it. There was no regular garbage collection. People threw their household waste directly into the street. This meant rotting vegetables, bones from a meal, old rags, broken pottery, and anything else they needed to get rid of. The street was the town's trash can. Pigs were often allowed to roam freely, and they acted as a kind of mobile cleanup crew. They would eat the organic waste, which was useful, but of course the pigs also produced their own waste, adding another layer to the mix. Then there was the human waste. Very few houses had any kind of internal plumbing. People used a chamber pot. When that pot was full, the most common solution was to open a window and empty it into the street below. There was a custom of shouting a warning, "Gardes low," which means watch out for the water. But that didn't make the waste disappear. It just landed in the street. Some towns had open channels running down the center or sides of the street, called kennels. These were supposed to act as open sewers, carrying waste away, especially when it rained. But often they were clogged and slow-moving, becoming long, stinking pools. Public latrines existed in some larger towns, often built over rivers. In London Bridge, for example, famously had latrines that dropped waste directly into the Thames. But for most people, the street or a backyard pit was the only option. The smell of human and animal excrement was simply a part of the urban air. It was unavoidable, animals were everywhere, a town was not just a place for humans. It was a hub of work, and that work required animal power. Horses and oxen pulled carts, their hooves churning the mud. Their manure dropped where it fell. Chickens, geese, and ducks pecked around in the alleys. People kept cows for milk and sheep for wool, sometimes in small pens right behind their houses. The sounds and smells of a farm were integrated into the fabric of town life. You would smell hay, manure, and the damp, earthy scent of livestock all the time. Beyond the general domestic mess, there were the smells of trade and industry. These were often the most powerful and offensive smells in the town. Certain professions were known for their stench. Tanners, for instance, were essential. They turned animal hides into leather, but the process was incredibly foul. They used urine, often collected in pots left outside homes, to remove hair from the hides. Then they used solutions made of animal dung to soften the leather. A tannery released a potent, gag-inducing smell of ammonia, decay, and chemicals. For this reason, tanners were usually forced to live and work at the edge of town or downstream along the river, so the worst of the smell and the polluted water was carried away from the majority of residents. Butchers were another source of strong smells. They slaughtered animals right in their shops or in the street outside. The blood would run into the kennels, staining them red. Unsold parts of the animal, the guts, the heads, the feet, would be thrown into a pile to be collected later or simply left to rot. The smell of blood, offal, and decaying meat was concentrated in the areas where butchers worked, like London's Stinking Lane. Dyers also produced powerful odors. They used various substances to color cloth, including lichens and plants, but also chemicals like alum and vats of stale urine, which was a source of ammonia used to fix the dyes. The fishmonger's stall had the obvious smell of fish, which would grow stronger as the day went on. And blacksmiths added the sharp, metallic smell of hot iron and the acrid smoke of coal fires. So, when you imagine walking through a medieval town, you have to imagine all of these smells hitting you at once. It's not a single bad smell. It's a complex soup of odors, the underlying smell of damp earth and rot. The sharp tang of human and animal waste, the smoke from countless wood fires, and then as you walk, you move through pockets of more intense smells, the stomach-turning stench of the tannery, the coppery smell of the butcher, the chemical sharpness of the dyer. This was the sensory world of the medieval street. It was pungent, raw, and full of information about the life and work happening all around you. After navigating the powerful smells of the street, you might think a medieval home would be a refuge. In some ways it was, but it had its own distinct and equally complex atmosphere. The smell of a home was shaped by the materials it was made from, the fire that was always burning, the food being cooked, and the people and animals living inside it. Most common people lived in small, simple houses. The walls were often made of wattle and daub, a woven lattice of wooden strips covered in a sticky material made from wet soil, clay, sand, and straw. The floors were usually just packed earth. The roof was typically thatch, made of straw or reeds. None of these materials are neutral. Earth floors held moisture and smells. Wattle and daub could get damp and mildewed. Thatch could rot and was a favorite home for mice, rats, and insects. The house itself had an earthy, slightly damp, and organic smell. The single most dominant smell in almost any medieval home was smoke. There was no central heating. Warmth came from a fire. In a peasant's cottage or a simple artisan's home, this was often an open hearth in the center of the main room. There was no chimney as we know it. At best, there was a hole in the roof to let some of the smoke out. But a lot of it didn't make it out. It filled the upper part of the room, blackening the rafters and ceiling. This wood smoke was a constant presence. It got into your clothes, your hair, and the walls of the house itself. It made your eyes water. But the smoke wasn't entirely negative. It helped to preserve the wood of the house, keeping insects away. It was also used to smoke and preserve meat, which would hang from the rafters, so that smell of wood smoke was often mixed with the savory smell of curing bacon or fish. The type of fuel also mattered. In some areas, people burned peat instead of wood, which created a heavier, sweeter, and even more pervasive smoke. The smell of smoke was the smell of warmth and survival. Cooking added another layer of smells. For many families, cooking was a one-pot affair. A large cauldron hung over the fire, and in it simmered a perpetual stew or pottage. It was made of grains like oats or barley and whatever vegetables were available, and onions, leeks, cabbage, peas. Meat or fish might be added if you were lucky. The smell of the simmering, savory stew was a constant background scent. Bread was another staple, and the smell of it baking, if the home had an oven or they used a communal one, was one of the most welcome smells possible. The living space was small and crowded. A whole family might live, eat, and sleep in one or two rooms. They lived in close proximity to each other, so the smell of unwashed bodies and sweat was part of the domestic air. And it wasn't just people. In colder months or for safety, families often brought their livestock inside at night. A cow, a few sheep, or some chickens might share the living space, so the smell of the barnyard manure, animal breath, damp wool was often brought right into the home. Hygiene inside the house was a challenge. The earth floors were impossible to truly clean. People would cover them with rushes or straw. This provided a bit of insulation and a softer surface to walk on. In wealthier homes, they might mix sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or meadowsweet in with the rushes. This helped to combat other odors and freshen the air, but the rushes weren't changed every day. Over time, they absorbed spilled food, drink, and whatever else fell on the floor. Eventually, the layer of herbs and straw would become its own source of a musty, fermenting smell. In a wealthy merchant's or nobleman's house, things were a bit different. The house would be made of stone or timber frame, which were less likely to smell of damp and rot. They had proper fireplaces with chimneys, which drew the smoke out of the room much more effectively. The rooms were larger and less crowded. They still had rushes on the floor, but they were more likely to be changed regularly and scented with expensive herbs. They also used tapestries on the walls, which helped with insulation but also trapped dust and smells of smoke and cooking. A rich home might smell of beeswax candles instead of cheaper tallow candles, which were made from animal fat and gave off a greasy, unpleasant odor when burned. There might be the smell of roasting meat from the kitchens, or the faint scent of expensive spices. But even in a castle, the smell of damp stone, smoke, unwashed dogs, and crowded human living was always present. The medieval home, then, was not a place of neutral air. It was a container for all the smells of life. The smoke of the fire, the simmer of the cooking pot, the breath of people and animals, the dampness of the walls, and the slow decay of the floor coverings all combined to create a unique and powerful indoor atmosphere. It was the smell of shelter. We've talked about the smells of the street and the home. But what about the people themselves? There is a common stereotype that medieval people were filthy, that they never washed, and that they were oblivious to their own body odor. The reality is more complicated. Their standards of cleanliness were different from ours, but they did care about hygiene. Bathing was not an unknown practice. The Romans had built great public bathhouses, and that tradition continued into the Middle Ages, though on a smaller scale. Most towns of any size had public bathhouses, sometimes called stews. People would go there to bathe in hot water, to get a steam bath, and to socialize. It was a communal activity. They weren't just for getting clean, they were a place to relax, meet friends, and do business. However, over time, many of these stews also gained a reputation as brothels, which led the church to condemn them and caused many to be shut down, especially after the plague. For those who didn't use public baths, bathing at home was an option, but it was a lot of work. You had to haul water from a well or river, heat it over the fire, and pour it into a wooden tub. It was a luxury. A lord or lady might take a bath fairly regularly, but for a common person, a full body bath was an infrequent event, perhaps a few times a year. But a full bath is not the only way to be clean. People wash their hands and face daily. It was a standard part of hospitality to offer a guest a basin of water to wash their hands upon arriving and before a meal. This was a practical matter, but also a religious one. Clean hands were associated with a clean soul. They didn't have the variety of scented soaps we have today. Soap did exist, but it was made from animal fat and lye wood ash. It was a harsh functional substance, more often used for laundry than for washing the body. People might use herbs like soapwort, which lathers in water, for a gentler wash. Clothing played a big role in medieval hygiene. Most people wore an undergarment, a linen shirt or shift, next to their skin. This linen is absorbent and relatively easy to wash. This undergarment was the key. It protected the more valuable outer garments from the sweat and oils of the body. A person might own only one or two outer tunics, which were often made of wool. Wool is difficult to clean, and it smells when it gets wet. So these outer clothes were rarely washed. Instead, they were brushed, aired out, and mended. But the linen shift underneath could be washed regularly. For a medieval person, being clean often meant putting on a clean linen shift, even if the outer clothes were not. This was a practical way to manage body odor and hygiene. Of course, not everyone had the means to wash their linen frequently. And in a world without modern deodorants, where people performed hard physical labor, the smell of sweat was a simple fact of life. It was the smell of work. It wouldn't have been considered as offensive or shocking as it is today. Yeah, it was just normal. Dental hygiene was another matter. They didn't have toothbrushes or toothpaste. To clean their teeth, people might rub them with a rough cloth, sometimes with an abrasive substance like salt or chalk. They might chew on a twig from a specific type of tree to clean their teeth and freshen their breath. But their diet, which was lower in sugar than ours, meant they might have had fewer cavities in some ways. However, they had no effective way to treat tooth decay. Infections and abscesses were common. As a result, bad breath was widespread and likely very strong. Remedies for it included chewing on aromatic seeds like cloves or parsley, but these could only mask the underlying problem. And then there was the smell of sickness. In an age before antibiotics and modern medicine, illness had a powerful and frightening smell. An infected wound would give off the odor of decay. Diseases like dysentery produce obvious and terrible smells. The breath of a person with a serious lung infection or a failing organ would be foul. People were highly attuned to these smells. The smell of sickness was not just unpleasant, it was a sign of danger and mortality. Doctors of the time even used smell as a diagnostic tool, believing that the scent of a person's breath, sweat, or urine could reveal the nature of their illness. So, the human smell in the Middle Ages was a mix. It was the smell of sweat from hard labor. It was the scent of wood smoke that clung to hair and clothes. It was the occasional foulness of bad breath or sickness. But it was also mitigated by practices like washing hands and wearing clean linen. They were not oblivious to smell. They simply lived in a world where the smells of the human body were more present and accepted as a natural part of being alive. To truly understand the medieval sensory world, we need to go beyond just listing good and bad smells. Smells were not just pleasant or unpleasant, they were full of meaning. They carried information about a person's health, wealth, social status, and even their moral character. The world of smell was a world of powerful symbols. Let's start with the good smells. In a world with so much stench, pleasant aromas were highly valued and actively sought out. The most powerful positive smells were often associated with wealth and holiness. The church was one of the few places a person could go to escape the foulness of the street and experience a truly transcendent smell. During Mass, priests would burn incense, usually frankincense and myrrh. The thick, sweet, aromatic smoke would fill the cathedral. For the average person, this smell was literally otherworldly. It was the smell of prayer. It was the smell of the divine, a deliberate and powerful contrast to the sinful, corrupt, and decaying smells of the outside world. Stepping into a church was a full sensory experience, and the smell of incense was a key part of its power. developed wealth also had a distinct smell. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper were incredibly expensive. They were imported from the East over vast distances. To use them in your food was the ultimate display of status. A wealthy lord's hall would not just smell of roasting meat and wood smoke, it would have the added exotic aroma of spices. This told every guest that the host was powerful and rich. Similarly, sugar, which was also a costly import, had a sweet smell that signaled luxury. Personal scent was also a marker of class. While common people might use simple, locally grown herbs to freshen their clothes, the wealthy had access to more exotic options. They carried pomanders, which were small metal balls, often beautifully decorated, filled with aromatic substances like ambergris, a waxy substance from whales, musk from musk deer, or a paste of spices and herbs. A person would hold this up to their nose in a smelly street or just wear it to surround themselves with a pleasant personal cloud of fragrance. It was a portable air freshener and a piece of jewelry in one. Flowers and herbs were a more accessible source of good smell. People cultivated gardens with fragrant plants like roses, lavender, and rosemary. They would bring these flowers indoors to scent the air. They would strew herbs on the floor. These smells were not just for pleasure, they were also thought to have protective qualities. This brings us to the meaning of bad smells. The dominant medical theory for centuries was the miasma theory. It held that diseases, especially epidemics like the plague, were caused by miasma, which meant bad air or a poisonous vapor filled with particles of decaying matter. A foul smell, therefore, was not just unpleasant. It was believed to be a direct physical threat. The stench of a swamp, of rotting garbage, or of a corpse was thought to be literally dangerous to breathe. During the Black Death, doctors wore beak-like masks. This image is famous, but the reason for the beak is often misunderstood. It wasn't just to look frightening. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and flowers, things like mint, cloves, and camphor. The idea was that this good-smelling air would filter out the poisonous miasma and protect the doctor from catching the plague. People burned bonfires in the streets and carried flowers, all in an attempt to combat the deadly bad air with protective good air. So, for the medieval person, a bad smell was a sign of death and disease. Smell also had a powerful moral and religious dimension. Stench was associated with sin, corruption, and hell. The devil and his demons were often described in texts as having a foul, sulfurous odor. This sinful place or a sinful person was thought to be spiritually, and sometimes literally foul-smelling. Decay was a physical manifestation of sin. Conversely, holiness had its own scent. A recurring theme in the lives of saints is the odor of sanctity. This was a miraculous sweet smell, often compared to flowers or spices that was said to emanate from the bodies of saints, especially after their death. When the tomb of a holy person was opened, and a beautiful fragrance was released instead of the expected stench of decay, it was taken as a divine sign of their sainthood. This sweet smell was proof that their body had resisted the corruption of sin and death. It was the physical proof of a pure soul. Smell, therefore, provided a direct link between the physical world and the spiritual one. It could signify the presence of God or the devil. So did medieval towns smell that bad? The direct answer is yes. By our 21st century standards, they smelled overwhelmingly bad. We live in a sanitized, deodorized world. Our sanitation systems carry waste away invisibly. Our garbage is sealed in plastic bags and removed. We have air fresheners, daily showers with scented soaps, and antibacterial everything. Our baseline for what is normal is a near total absence of strong organic smells. A medieval town would be a massive sensory shock to our modern noses, but this is the key point: they were not modern people. Their noses were different, not biologically different, but culturally different. They lived in a state of what we might call olfactory habituation. It's the same reason someone who lives near a paper mill or a coffee roaster eventually stops noticing the smell. The human brain is good at tuning out constant background noise, and that includes smells. The general, pervasive stench of manure, smoke, and rot was simply the normal smell of their world. It wouldn't have been something they consciously thought about all the time, any more than we think about the smell of traffic fumes or air conditioning. They would not have been constantly walking around gagging. Instead, they would have been highly attuned to changes in the smellscape. Their noses were tools for gathering information. A new or unusual smell would register immediately. The smell of spoiled meat in the pottage was a warning of food poisoning. The sudden sweet cloying smell associated with the plague was a sign of mortal danger. The smell of rain on the dusty street told you the weather was changing. A person's trade could often be identified by their smell long before you saw them: the tanner, the fishwife, the blacksmith. Their world was richer in smells, and as a result, their sense of smell was likely a much more important and refined source of information than ours is today. We tend to think of smell as a secondary sense, less important than sight or hearing. For them, it was arguably more immediate and vital. It was a way of diagnosing illness, assessing danger, identifying social status, and even experiencing the divine. They didn't just tolerate bad smells, they navigated a world that was defined by them. They understood the difference between the everyday harmless smell of a horse in the street and the alarming dangerous smell of disease. Our revulsion at the idea of a medieval town is a product of our own time and place. We have successfully engineered most strong, unpleasant smells out of our daily lives. We see this as progress, and in terms of public health, it undoubtedly is. But in doing so, we've also lost a certain kind of sensory connection to the world around us, to the processes of life, death, and decay. So to answer the question in a more complete way, yes, a medieval town would smell terrible to us. But to the people who lived there, it just smelled like home. It was a complex tapestry of odors, ranging from the mundane to the terrifying, from the sinful to the sacred. It was the smell of work, of food, of life, and of death, all mixed together in the open air. It wasn't just a bad smell, it was their reality, and they had the nose for it.